So I'd like to introduce, officially introduce Frank X. Walker. We got to start the week off with Frank, and we're gonna make our last reading with him as well. I didn't read his full bio, and I think I would like to get it into the record for anybody that reads this in the future. Frank has been teaching a workshop that I love the title. It's Uncomfortable Skin, Accessing the Courage and Voices of Persona, Poetry, and History. Frank has published 10 collections of poetry, including Turn Me Loose, The Unghosting of Medgar Evers, which was awarded the 2014 NAACP Image Award for poetry. He's also the author of Buffalo Dance, The Journey of York, which is the first time I'd heard of Frank, winner of the 2004 Lillian Smith Book Award, a lover of comics. He curated We Wear the Mask, Black Superheroes Through the Ages, and he coined the term Affrilachia, which I'm probably butchering because I live on the West Coast. He co-founded the Affrilachian Poets. His honors include a 2004 Lannan Literary Fellowship for Poetry, the 2008-2009 Denny C. Plattner Award for Outstanding Poetry and Appalachian Heritage, as well as fellowships and residencies with Cave Canem, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Kentucky Arts Council. He's just, in other words, an amazing and wonderful person. So please welcome Frank.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I hope I have enough energy left to give you guys a decent reading. I'm gonna at least read from these two collections because they tie me to the Wallowa Valley, and they deal with I don't think of them as Lewis and Clark. I always think of them as an opportunity to be with the Nez Perce. I'm gonna read from Buffalo Dance, The Journey of York, and When Winter Come, The Ascension of York. And for me, it's an easy choice because my connection to Oregon, for the most part, is having come out forever ago and read from Buffalo Dance. And I thought that was the end of the book, and the end of sharing, the end of the story, and my connection with the West, you know, being a Kentucky boy. But immediately after the reading, I walked out of the cabin, and 3 elders from the Nez Perce tribe were standing there with books for me to sign. And in our exchange, I begged for them to invite me to the reservation, to the school. And I ended up the next summer after Fishtrap, you know, back in Oregon and Idaho, Montana, driving around, you know, spending time on the res, visiting the school, doing workshops, visiting a friend in Montana. I brought my son, and I began a relationship with the Nez Perce that included them gifting me with a transcribed copy of their oral history. And in the oral history, it talks specifically about York, who was with the Lewis and Clark expedition. But these details talked about York's relationship with the daughter of a chief of the Nez Perce, and their marriage, their courtship, their marriage, and the fact that they produced a son. And I had the privilege with my own son to break bread over the course of 2 summers with descendants of York, something that could never happen on my side of the country and the Mississippi River in Kentucky. I lived in Louisville at the time, the very same city that York had lived in before he left to go out west with an expedition. And there's no conversation about York descendants. There's little evidence that any even existed. And here I was not only hearing about it, but I had sat down and had meals with them. And so when they gave me the oral histories, they said, do something with this. And out of that came the second book, When Winter Come, which tries to retell the story, but do a better job being more inclusive, including Nez Perce and other voices, and the voices of women who are also left out. So I'm gonna focus on trying to set the stage with giving you York and some key points in the story, in the narrative, and then moving through the expedition to the end so that you hear from the women who are part of the story. And that should probably fill up the time. I just read them straight through and then post your questions at the end if you have any or comments. So I'm going to start with the very first poem in this whole story. There are 3 of these books now. First one is called Wind Talker, and it imagines York at the Pacific Ocean, missing his wife and thinking about the fact that he's illiterate and he can't write. He's been watching at least 5 people in the expedition write down details in journals, letters that will go home and tell what has been happening the last year and a half of their life. And all he can do is wish that to happen in this moment. So this is called Wind Talker in the voice of York, who traveled with Lewis and Clark. If I could make my words dress they naked selves in blackberry juice, lay down on a piece of bark, sheep, or onion skin like massa do. If I could send a letter home to my wife, floated in the wind on wings or water, I'd tell her about Katonka and all the wide and high places this side of the big river, how his family, numbering 3 for every star in the sky, looked like a force when they grazed together, turn into the muddy Missouri when they thunder along faster than any horse, making the grass lay down long after the quiet has returned. How they don't so much as raise a tail when I come round with my woolly head and tobacco skin, like I'm one of them, making the Arikara and Mandan think me big medicine, Katonka who walk like man. Today, we stood on the edge of all this, looked out at so much water, the mountains we crossed to get here seem a little smaller. As I watch fish the size of cabins dance in the air and splash back in the water like children playing, I think about her, and if we gonna ever be free, then I close my eyes and pray that I don't live long enough to see Massa make this ugly too. So they were traveling for a year and a half, but on the way out, one of the things that became central to me after I started traveling to the Great Northwest to do research for the book is how important the landscape was. So the first big trip out encouraged me to write this poem called God's House in the voice of York. When we first left Kentucky, the trees had commenced to dressing up the fall harvest, and the garden was already full of pumpkins and squash. Master Clark didn't ask me to go on no expedition. He just said, pack, and pointed to the door. So I gather up what little I got and more than I could carry his, and head off on a sail-bearing keel boat where his friend, Master Lewis, was waiting. That boat was so big, you could lay any 10 of the 16 men on board, or 8 of me, head to toe, and still have enough room for the dog. He starts out on the Ohio and swing up the Old Man of Rivers, and it gets to the mouth of the dark woman they calls the Big Muddy. He sets up winter camp a good canoe ride from St. Louis. That spring, when the rains come, we cross the Mississippi and commence to climb into Missouri and float right up through heaven on earth. More sky than I ever seen, rocks as pretty as trees, and game so plentiful, they come right down to the riverbank and invites themselves to dinner. Now, I ain't what you would call a scripture quoter, but the first time I seen the waterfall at Missouri, felt I heard a buffalo stampede and looked down from the top of Rock Mountains, it was like church. And where else but God's house can a body servant big as me carry a rifle, hatchet, and a bone-handled knife so sharp it can peel the black off a lump of coal? And the white man still closes his eyes and feels safe at night. Primer. The only book we allowed to know is the Bible. Though many a slave been sold south, had fingers chopped off, and worse for the crime of reading and writing. I figures my respect for good telling come from listening to old York weave his magic at night. Folk hung from our porch like baby possums and lived off the breath he'd give to every story, no matter how many times they tasted the tale. I learned to appreciate the power of single words holding a lamp over Master Clark while he studied his brother's letters and struggled with his own returns. Them think all slaves dumb because we can't cipher, but they be surprised how many words we pick up to stand around like trees in a room full of educated men. And the heart of the narrative I'm going to share today is about the relationship between York and his two wives, his enslaved wife and his Nez Perce wife. And I'm going to pull two out of this section and then move on to the second book. But Sundays in Christmas is called Sundays in Christmas because it was the rare time slaves owned by different families would have a quote unquote holiday and could visit each other. So he got to see this woman in Kentucky only on Sundays and Christmas, even though they were married. Sundays and Christmas. The voice of York. I cares plenty for my wife, but I've been told a slave can't truly know love, being his master and white men's in general have and takes certain privileges with our women. I suspect the deepest hurt in the world be to risk being tied to a woman's hearth and standing on the front porch while the master part her thighs, knowing that any cry raised is inviting death or worse. But what else but love make you hold that woman even tighter, try to rock her back to whole long after the tears dry up and the hurt turns the ashes back to flames? It be a nighttime and deep into winter, I can think of no other breath I wish to feel and no other whisper I ache to hear. What we loud to feel might not rate as love, but it be powerful enough to make you rule the time between visits. So we've established the fact that, York has a woman that he's in love with, or at least married to, back in Kentucky. And even though it's well documented that most of the men in the expedition slept with native women the whole way out and the whole way back, and there are a lot of kids that were the product of that. I'm going to focus on the courtship and relationship that developed for York when he spent the winter with the Nez Perce. And one of the things he had to recognize is how different it was to be in a relationship in a space where he was revered and respected for the very same things that were considered subhuman back in the East, in Kentucky specifically. So this first poem, before I get there, tries to speak to that difference and the beauty of Nez Perce women. And this is York again in the second book. When the man then tried to kill his wife, aligned with Sergeant Ordway, it caused the captains to place marriage squads off limits to the men's private commerce. One of them laughed and bragged about having his way with a daughter of a chief for no more than an empty tobacco box. When we learned the Indians believe our power can change hands and be gifted by passing between a woman's thighs, we all take advantage at every occasion and in most every village all along the great trip out and back. With Captain Clark's permission, I don't hesitate to enjoy myself and even have my nose opened wide by a Nez Perce woman as beautiful and rugged as the land we traveling through. Like a virgin, this is York again. Grown folk don't walk around on the plantation holding hands, go for canoe rides or take long walks with each other. My Nez Perce gal was the first woman I choose on my own and that I didn't have to share with another. I found myself staring into her eyes and smiling, learning my big buffalo self to move like a turtle in her arms. Men in the party think it's strange that I not brag about how many ways or how long we ride each other. This way of being with a woman be so new and tender. I close my eyes and feel like a fresh-born calf stumbling on weak, wet legs, discovering that it's not the ground that be moving. This is York's Nez Perce wife speaking, called Like Raven from Head to Toe. His hair and strength was not unlike that of a woolly-headed buffalo. Some of my people thought he had been burned by a great fire. Others thought he had painted himself in charcoal, as was the custom for warriors returning from the warpath, making him the bravest among his party. 2 hard, wet fingers did not remove the black from his forearm or head, nor did the sweat from our naked turtle dance make his salty skin any less like the night. The Nez Perce wife again. Art of seduction. I know a hungry man's eye can undress a woman from across a smoldering fire because York did it. When I grew warm to his advances, I gave him permission and invited him over without ever opening my mouth. I looked away, then back, then away, then back, so slow. When my eyes returned to meet his, it made his nostrils flare and my heart beat like 2 drums in my chest. He didn't have a courting flute, so the first music we made between us was a way of looking into each other's eyes and exchanging naked promises so full of heat. Passers-by would swear we were already man and wife. His big hands were rough from a life full of hard work, but when they were filled with me, each one became a party of men deep in the wilderness, intent on exploring every mound and knowing all of the hollowed out and sacred spaces. Quiet storm, still the Nez Perce wife. While out searching for camas and other roots to celebrate our choosing each other, I made pictures with my fingers and lips trying to make the raven's son understand the number and beauty of the butterfly. A rainstorm came out of the hills and forced us to crawl under a giant pine's outstretched wings. The soft bed of needles under us and the music and the steady downpour left us so warm and wet, we barely noticed when the rain stopped and moved on across the valley. Before our lips and tongues finally parted, we floated like 2 eagles, circling mid-air, trying to pass off a just caught salmon a mile above the clear water. And this next poem is one of the poems that caused the York books to be banned in middle schools in Kentucky. This is called Midnight Ride, York's Nez Perce wife. After the fires die down, a moon full of shine allows us to wander off into the night's arms. Urged on by the river and the night's music, our 2 quickly become one. Straddled aboard him, a buffalo robe around my shoulders and nothing else, I close my eyes and ride low and close, the way a hunter tracks buffalo in the deep winter snow. Our gentle trot becomes a gallop, and after a good sweat, our gallop becomes a quiet stand. Then we bow our heads and wait for our breaths to catch up. After a quick dip in the cold river, I mount back up for warmth, and we ride slow and long until my legs quiver and York finds the strength to harness himself. When he carries me back home to our mat, folded up in his arms like a child, we lie down in the lap of the night, both empty and full and sleep. Now, one of the main issues in the first book was trying to create this idea of York's illiteracy. So I read a poem earlier called Primer. This is called Primer 2. It speaks to a different way of reading things in the world, things in nature specifically. This is called Primer 2 in the voice of York. I can read the heart of a woman in her eyes as easy as a lie in a man's face. The direction and power of a storm speaks clearly to me from low-flying bird wings. I can dip my fingers into muddy hoof or toe print and tell how many or what I'm gonna have for dinner. The thickness of tree bark, walnut hulls, and tobacco worms tell me how ugly winter gonna be. I knows the seasons like a book. I can read moss, clouds, sunsets, the moon, and the mare's folding time with a touch. But I would trade all this to know how to scratch out my name as more than the X. To have my stories leap off paper as easy as they roll off my tongue. To listen to my own eyes make the words on parchment say, this man here be York. He can come and go as he please, work for himself, own land, learn his books, live and die free. I'm gonna fast forward towards the end of this collection and close with a set of poems that earn the voice of York's enslaved wives. So after the 3-year expedition, he returns back to Kentucky very briefly because William Clark sent him to Kentucky to say goodbye to his wife because he's now been stationed in St. Louis and he wants York to be there to continue to serve him in St. Louis, even though he's promised to free York because of his tremendous contributions during the expedition. But he changed his mind, or he lied. And so when York arrives home, I imagine, like any man in love, he's having a hard time disguising the guilt he probably felt having fathered another child, married another woman, and then what some would may consider disloyal to his wife back in Kentucky. But this is called Say My Name, and these next poems are in York's enslaved wife's voice. Say my name. Folks around here want to call me Auntie, York's old wife, or Master So-and-so's nigger wench, like I ain't got a name of my own. Them don't know how hard it be to put aside a little piece of myself that nobody can't never touch but me. A piece big enough to wrestle the long, hard days and keep itself warm at night without a man around. Them don't know what it's like to stand in the dark, night after night, wrapped in that buffalo robe he sent, look up at the stars and wonder which ones is looking down on him, and believe if something bad happened out there that I would feel it too. When he come home, I don't need him to say he loved me. I don't need him to bring me gifts. I just want him to hold me close, make like he glad to see me, bend down to my ear and whisper my name. I also imagine that when she looked at him really close, she knew something was different about him. So this is called Unwelcome Guest. York's enslaved wife. I don't think York knowed I could see her too. The first time was in the corner of his eye, while he looked far off but stared at the plate right in front of him. He didn't say nothing about her, but the way his lips turned up at the ends said plenty. Now I ain't one to sass. His growl helped me to know a slave woman's place. So I sits up all night with both my hands and ears open, wait to catch her name on his lips. After that, no matter how much he talk of grizzlies, buffaloes, big fish, mountains, or oceans, she become all I can see, all I wants to know. It gets so crowded in our little place, I swears I can almost smell her. And by then I knows one of us will have to go. Now she can't take him to divorce court. I mean, they were married, but they were also still enslaved, so they didn't have much respect in the American court system. But it didn't mean that she didn't have some means to respond to this thing. So this is her response. It's called The Sunflower Seed Oil Conjure, York's Enslaved Wife. First, I get some fresh well water and puts it on to boil. Stirs up a tea brewed from apricot vine, rattlesnake weed, and plenty of honey. Then I sets him down between my knees and with a wooden tooth comb left to me by my mama's mama, commences to scratching at his scalp till his shoulders look covered with snow. Then I fills up my wash tub with boiling water doctored with peppermint root and sets to scrubbing him slow enough for the heat to open his doors. When his body is clean, I starts back to work on his head, busting up a mean suds and using my fingers to walk up and down his scalp till he lets loose a low moan and his eyes start to roll around in his head. After I rinses and twists all the forest out, I starts back in with warm sunflower seed oil, only this time every finger make its own little circle while both my hands make bigger ones. And they follows each other from the stiff tree limbs in the back of his neck, across his crown to the soft spot while my thumbs dig in slow and deep where the headaches come on. I pours the extra oil into my hands and rub his neck and shoulders down to his ribs and arms. Then, like a turtle dance, I moves back up again. I work slow and hard, and after a while, when I gets all the way to his man sack, he open his eyes and be glad it's me. And don't try that at home. I'm gonna close with two poems, one in her voice and one in York's voice. And it tries to speak to the challenges of maintaining a healthy relationship under the conditions of enslavement. When another man can come to your house and order you on the porch while he spends time with your wife, and if you say anything, it might cost you your death. And this is more about not that actual act, but what happens after that man is gone and his husband and wife are now face to face and she's just been raped. And they have no power to do anything about that wouldn't cost them their life. How do you survive that? This is called To Have and To Hold. This is York. It do more harm than good to be enslaved and agree to love forever. But there be folks over us with even more power than death to do us part. Being another man's property, all I can promise is when we in the same quarters, no one will hold you closer or with more tenderness than me. If ever I have to choose between another day of service and death, I will always choose living. Even if master sell me down the Mississippi tomorrow or pair me up with another woman to breed, I will only think on what we had and chase away thoughts of what we had not. I aims to see you every Sunday and Christmas, but if ever I'm away more than 2 whole seasons without sending back word, untie the ribbons for that broom we jump, mourn for me but a little, then set your mind to figuring on how you gonna stay warm when winter come. Then I'll close in her voice. It's a poem called Real Cost, York's enslaved wife. Somewhere out there, he learned to touch me like I'm a woman, and not just some woman, me. In our marriage bed, he seemed as interested in pleasing me as he be in spilling himself. I knew he'd come back changed when new words fall out of his mouth like love and freedom and manhood. And there come a look in his eye like he owned all three, free and clear, and don't need no papers to prove it. But it scared me because I seen that look in many a black eye before white hammers nailed it shut or left it frozen open and swinging to teach the rest what anything that smelled like courage cost. I have no doubt he give his life to stay with me. So I don't tell him that Massa taking me back down south. I just kiss him soft to sleep and stare at him long enough to call up his face when I gets old and thankful he still be breathing somewhere when winter come. Thank you. I think I'll stop there for the sake of time and entertain your questions or comments if you have any.
Thank you so much. Wow. I have a couple questions, and as I always do, I'll jump in before while people get a chance to kind of gather themselves. Thank you so much for that. I was curious about your research process with that, because I know, you know, there's not, I don't know how much there is knowledge of York and other aspects of, you know, his life in the expedition. What did you need to do to, you know, what was the research process for that?
At first, I need to find every book I could find that even mentioned him.
Yeah.
Which meant that I purchased 3 different sets of journals or abridged journals and try to find every reference for York. And he was there. There was also a book written by Jim Holmberg called In Search of York. And it was really a summary of other scholars' attempts to find out details about York. All of that led me to St. Louis. A lot of people know about the arch over the city downtown, but they didn't know that below ground there was a football-length museum that was the Westwood Expansion Museum, and it held the largest Lewis and Clark collection of paraphernalia in the world. So I spent a whole lot of weekends in that space, you know, full weekends, and I would visit the bookstore on the way home on Sundays and buy whatever I could afford to take back home with me. They had an IMAX film that reenacted the journey all the way to the ocean, but not back. And I paid to watch it about 10 times before they told me I could buy a copy of it, which ended up being a good thing, because what I would do when I got back to Kentucky to write is that before I went to sleep at night, I'd put the video in and just watch it and fall asleep. And it made me dream about the expedition. So that process allowed me to wake up with all these ideas and poems and closer to the stuff I was writing about. I write in the morning mostly anyway, so it was a very liberating process for me to have those images be the last things I saw. And the last things, so it kind of set my unconscious in search of all these things that continue the expedition. And ultimately, the research wasn't complete until I started journeying out west. My son and I, over the course of 3 summers total, we researched as much of the trails we could from St. Louis to the Pacific Ocean. We spent a lot of time in Montana. The entire Montana park system is based on the Lewis and Clark Trail. We flew to Portland one weekend, rented a car and drove up and down the Columbia River, all the way to the ocean. We spent time on the res at all the park ranger stations. But ultimately, it was being outdoors, being in the same spaces. Much of the trail is still unspoiled, you know, and looked a lot like what I imagine they saw back then. The biggest difference is there aren't hundreds of thousands of buffalo. But even then, we found several places that still herded buffalo, or you can see them in a semi-natural state, and they helped a lot too. But it was labor doing the research. It was expensive too, and I didn't really know what I was doing. I just knew that I was interested, and I just needed to know. I knew I couldn't finish the book until I felt like I satisfied all the potential questions that I needed to know in order to answer the ones that will come from the audience in the future.
No, you gave him a voice, which is pretty powerful. Kristen wanted to know if you found it, do you find it natural to switch between the voices, or was that a difficult shift? Did you ever find that a difficult shift?
It was a little harder. Maybe 10 years ago. I mean, this book is old by now.
Right.
But now I've written so many persona collections since then that switching voices is easier for me than it was then, because I, like most poets up until that time, I just wrote in my own voice. You know, it was me speaking from the page, and you know, I had to teach myself the process and the discipline and the distance it took to assume somebody else's skin and story and voice. And it wasn't impossible, because it was another man of color who also lived in Kentucky at one point. And I was a little older than he was at the time. But two outdoors, you know, I grew up in a small town. You know, both sides of my family come from farm existences. So I was a big country boy, and these things seemed really close to me. And I trusted the research. So it wasn't hard to write just in the voice of York. By the time I got to the second book, when it was Sacagawea or Sacagawea, Lewis and Clark, you know, York's stepmother, his father, his mother, a Native American shaman. I mean, they were the voice of the river, his hatchet, his hunting shirt, his knife. Everybody has something to say to help tell the story. And my challenge was to make them all sound different and look different on the page, which was an additional challenge. I like to think that we pulled that off.
You talked about at the beginning about adding the voice of women into this story. You have, what was your experience with that? How did you go about that? You know, the excerpts you read were largely in context of relationship and sex and closeness there. Were there other, how else did you approach that? You know, thinking about being inside the voice of a woman.
Well, for me, that may have been almost as easy as writing from York's point of view, only because I have 7 sisters.
Yeah.
And I felt like, because they're both older and younger, by the time I started the book and the research, there wasn't much from a woman I felt like I hadn't heard. Every emotional point, you know, from highs to lows. And my sisters, none of them are alike. They're all very different. So between them and my mother, who was also a very willing audience member, she would call me at 8 o'clock every morning. I'd be at work at 9. She would call me at 8 on the dot during the research and say, "Did York say anything new today?" And I would say, you know, a couple of things. She would say, "Read it to me." And I would read her the new poems. And then she would say, "Read it again." And I'll read it again, and maybe a third time. And then she'll say, and then hang up. She didn't say, "How are you doing? What's your day gonna be like?" She just wanted to know about York.
Like that Tyler story.
Yeah. You know, on the cover of the book this is the clay version of a bronze statue in Kentucky at the river. It's a 9-foot tall bronze sculpture done by a friend of mine named Ed Hamilton. And Ed was building this sculpture the same time I was researching, writing the book. So we shared research information. Right. And when I would get what people call writer's block, or I needed inspiration, I would just go down to a studio and look, and then go home. One morning, I'd been going down for about 4 weeks, and York never had a face. And at night, Ed would cover up the clay version, and because of condensation, when he uncovered it in the morning, there'd be all these beads of water rolling off. So I come down one morning, you know, really stuck. He pulls off the plastic, and there's York with a face and shoulders and skin, veins, and he looked like he's sweating. And I just go, and I go home, and I stay up the whole weekend. I think I wrote like 11 poems that weekend. They weren't all good, but I felt so close to York, having now seen a face that could represent him, that I was right there. And that really helped a lot. And at the public unveiling of that statue, my mother was there. And she loves to hear me tell the story. They were waiting for somebody to give the official sign and pull a rope and have this black cloth pulled off. but the wind came because it was about to storm, and the wind pulled it up all by itself, and it just floated away. And she looked up, and she had never seen it before, and she almost fainted. She just swooned and fell back. I mean, she was in love with him as the idea of York, but then when she saw this image, this 9-foot tall bronze, she was like, she used to make jokes about, I think that's your daddy. But yeah, the whole family was involved in the only book I've ever worked on where they were that intimately involved in the whole process.
Right.
It was definitely her favorite book of all the ones I've written.
Good. Mal wanted to know if you, how you discovered that you wanted to write about York.
Out of embarrassment, you know, I went to a Chautauqua presentation where a gentleman I'd known for other reasons did this whole presentation and as York, or a scholar talking about York, and then answered questions about York. And I had, at that point, already had a college degree. And I was embarrassed that I had never heard of York. And he had been in the same city I lived in at the time. And I thought about, you know, how I felt having that ignorance, and if I wanted to pass it on to my kids. And I made a commitment at that point to try to erase that. You know, I became hungry about trying to find out everything I could about him. But I wasn't trying to write a book. I was trying to find enough information to be able to talk about him in a real way to people who also didn't know who he was. Everybody I talked to had never heard of him. But now, at least in Kentucky, you know, it's like there are statues and plaques and books and children's books and T-shirts and events and festivals. We were way behind the rest of the country. But even in the Great Northwest, even the depictions of York were not realistic. You know, when you see him in older murals or even in statues with 3 or 4 characters, they show him as this diminutive man, you know, maybe 5'2" or smaller, 130 pounds. But if you read the journals, York looked more like an NFL defensive lineman and moved like a defensive end. And the journals talked about him performing feats of strength for Native American children and natives, and him dancing at native gatherings, and them being surprised at how such a large man could move, and how he was so nimble for such a large man. But it was a pleasure to have the one in Kentucky that depicted him accurately based on the descriptions in the journals.
Well, I'm going to close this with Ellen Waterston wrote a lovely note to you about she treasured this poet and this collection since first encountering you in Buffalo Dance when you were a guest at the Nature of Words a decade ago. Thank you, and thank you for all your beautiful and important words since. And I think everyone here would echo that for those of you that are just discovering Frank X for the first time, and for those of you who I'm sure we're all signed on as fans forever. So thank you for taking time today. Absolutely appreciate it.